The sun burned low over the Wyoming frontier, painting the sky a bruised red. Dust swirled in the town square, kicked up by boots and wagon wheels, settling on Clara's faded calico dress. She stood on a splintered wooden platform, wrists bound, loosely with hemp rope, her dark hair falling in limp strands across her face. The rope was more show than restraint. She wasn't going anywhere. Not with the crowd's eyes pinning her in place, their whispers sharp as cactus spines. The price of a steer. Her father bellowed, his voice cracked from whiskey and desperation. His hand, gnarled as sagebrush, gestured at her like she was livestock. Good hands, strong back, won't eat much. The words landed like stones in Clara's gut. She kept. Her eyes on the horizon, where the mountains jagged against the sky, unyielding and cold. Her father's debts had carved her into this. A thing to be sold, a weight to be shed. The crowd murmured. A woman in a bonnet spat into the dirt. A man with a tobacco-stained beard laughed, low and mean. Clara's bare toes curled against the platform's rough grain, her breath shallow, like she was trying not to exist. Her husband Thomas had cast her out 3 months ago, his voice flat as a coffin lid, barren, useless. She'd carried that word in her chest ever since, heavy as a millstone. She didn't look at the faces, not at the pity, not at the scorn. She watched a single crow circle above, its wings cutting the air like a blade. The wind tugged at her skirt, and the frayed hem danced, revealing a bruise on her ankle, purple as the dusk. She shifted, hiding it. No one needed to see her shame. $10, a voice called from the back. Clara's heart lurched, but she didn't turn. The voice was slurred, eager. She knew that kind of man. The kind who'd buy her for a night, not a life. Her father's grin widened, showing cracked teeth. He raised a hand to seal the bid. 15. Another voice, low and steady, cut through the din. The crowd parted, heads turning. A man stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, his flannel shirt patched at the elbows. His hands were rough, calloused from an axe, knuckles scarred like knotted pine. Silas, the lumberjack. His face was weathered, eyes shadowed under a worn hat, but they held no cruelty. Just quiet. Clara met his gaze for a moment. His eyes were gray, like river stones smoothed by years of current. She looked away, her throat tight. She didn't know him, didn't want to. But the crowd's jeers softened, replaced by curious murmurs. Silas didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small stack of crumpled bills, and handed them to her father without a word. The transaction was done before Clara could blink. Her father untied the rope, his fingers brushing. Her wrist cold as a snake's skin. "Go on, girl," he muttered, already counting the money. Clara stepped off the platform, her legs trembling, the dust sticking to her damp palms. Silas didn't touch her. He just nodded toward a wagon waiting at the square's edge. It's wood, chipped and faded, a single mule hitched to the front. She followed him, her steps small, her shoes scuffing the dirt. The crowd watched, their whispers trailing her like a shadow. She climbed onto the wagon's hard bench, her hands folded in her lap, the rope's faint burn still on her wrists. Silas took the reins, his movements slow, deliberate. The mule snorted, and the wagon creaked forward, leaving the town behind. The road stretched into the wilderness, flanked by sagebrush and twisted junipers. The air smelled of dust and pine, sharp and clean. Clara stared at her hands, at the cracked nails, the faint scar on her thumb from a kitchen knife long ago. She didn't ask where they were going, didn't ask why he'd bought her. The silence between them was heavy, but not cruel. Like the weight of a quilt in winter. Silas kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight, a faint line of sweat on his brow. The wagon's wheels groaned, and a single wind chime tied to the side clinked softly, its sound fragile against the vastness of the plains. Clara clutched the edge of the bench, her fingers brushing a splinter. She didn't pull away. The small pain felt real, something to hold on to. The mountains loomed closer now, their peaks sharp against the fading light. Clara's chest ached, not from tears, but from the quiet terror of being no one's. She didn't know if she was saved or just traded. But the wagon kept moving, and for now, that was enough. The wagon rattled along a rutted trail, the mountains swallowing the last of the sun. Clara's hands stayed folded, her knuckles white against the faded blue of her dress. The wind chime clinked, a lonely sound against the hum of crickets and knives. The mule's heavy breaths. Silas drove in silence, his shoulders hunched, the reins loose in his calloused hands. The air grew cooler, sharp with pine and the faint musk of damp earth. Clara's eyes traced the horizon, where stars began to prick the velvet sky. She wondered if this was freedom, or just another cage. The trail narrowed, hemmed by gnarled cedars and rocks jagged as broken teeth. The wagon stopped before a cabin, its logs weathered gray, sagging under the weight of years. A single lantern hung by the door, its light flickering like a tired eye. 4 small faces peered from the window, their breath fogging the cracked glass. Clara's chest tightened. Children she hadn't known. Silas climbed down, his boots crunching gravel. He didn't look at her, just unhitched the mule with slow, practiced motions. Clara stayed on the bench, her fingers brushing the splintered wood, her pulse loud in her ears. The door creaked open, and a girl, maybe 10, stepped out, her braid unraveling, her eyes sharp as flint. "Who's she?" the girl asked, voice low, suspicious. "Clara," Silas said simply, not turning. "She's staying." He carried a sack of flour from the wagon, his steps heavy but sure. The girl stared, her bare feet shifting in the dirt. Clara forced herself to stand, her legs stiff, her dress catching on a nail in the bench. She tugged it free, the faint rip loud in the quiet. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. A table stood crooked, one leg propped on a flat stone. A quilt, patched and faded, hung over a chair. The children watched her. The girl, with the braid, a boy with a chipped tooth, another with a face smudged with dirt, and the smallest, a girl no older than 4, clutching a rag doll. Their eyes held no warmth, only questions. Clara's throat burned. She looked away, at the blackened kettle in the hearth, at the broom leaning in the corner, its bristles worn to stubs. Silas set the flour on the table. "Eat," he said, nodding. To a loaf of bread, hard as a brick. Clara hesitated, then broke off a piece, her fingers trembling. The children ate in silence, their spoons scraping tin bowls. Clara chewed slowly, the bread dry in her mouth. She felt their stares, heavy as the air before a storm. Night fell, and Silas pointed to a pallet by the hearth. "Yours," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. Clara nodded, her hands smoothing her skirt, the fabric thin under her fingers. She lay down, the straw crackling beneath her, the quilt heavy with the scent of lye. The children slept in a loft above, their whispers drifting like leaves. She caught words. "Mama's gone, and she's not her." Clara closed her eyes, her breath shallow, waiting for a shout, a hand, a demand. None came. Days blurred into weeks. The cabin was a world of its own, cut off by miles of sagebrush and stone. Clara rose before dawn, her hands finding work before her mind could wander. She swept the floor, the broom's rhythm steadying her. She kneaded dough, her knuckles pressing into flour-dusted wood. She mended a shirt, the needle pricking her thumb. A bead of blood blooming like a tiny rose. Silas worked the land, his, axe thudding against pine, his shadow long in the evening light. He spoke little, his words clipped, but never sharp. He didn't ask for a wife, didn't ask for anything. The children kept their distance. The oldest girl, Ellie, watched Clara. Like a hawk, her eyes narrowing when Clara stirred the stew or patched a torn sleeve. The boys, Jonah and Sam, darted past her, their laughter fading when she turned. The youngest, Lila, clung to her doll, her small fingers twisting its yarn hair. Clara didn't push. She moved quietly, her steps soft on the creaking boards, her hands busy but gentle. She felt like a ghost in their home, present but unseen. One morning, Clara found a tin cup tipped over, milk pooling on the table. She reached for a rag, her sleeve brushing the spill. Ellie's voice cut through. "Don't touch that." Clara froze, her hand hovering, the rag damp in her grip. Ellie's cheeks flushed, her braid swinging as she snatched the cup. "It was Mama's," she whispered, her voice breaking. Clara nodded, stepping back, her heart a stone in her chest. She turned to the hearth, stirring the fire, the flames licking the air like a prayer. Silas watched from the doorway, his hat his hands, his fingers tracing its warm brim. He didn't speak, just nodded once, his eyes meeting hers. Not pity, not judgment, just acknowledgement. Clara exhaled, her breath catching the fire's warmth. She wasn't home, not yet. But the cabin's walls didn't feel like bars. For now, that was enough. The Wyoming wind howled, rattling the cabin's loose shutters. Clara woke to the sound, her breath visible in the pre-dawn chill. The hearth's embers glowed faintly, casting shadows on the rough-hewn walls. She rose, her bare feet cold against the floorboards, and tucked the quilt around her shoulders. The children slept above, their breaths uneven, a soft chorus in the dark. Lila's cough, sharp and dry, cut through. Clara paused, her hand on the broom, listening. The cough came. Again, small but insistent, like a pebble in a stream. By noon, Lila burned with fever. Her small body curled on the pallet, her rag doll limp in her arms. Clara knelt beside her, the floor hard under her knees. Lila's cheeks were flushed, her lips cracked, her eyes half open, glassy as a frozen pond. Clara pressed a damp cloth to the girl's forehead, the water dripping down her wrist, cold as snowmelt. Ellie hovered nearby, her braid frayed, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "She be fine," Ellie said, her voice sharp, more ply than promise. Clara didn't answer. She dipped the cloth again, the tin basin clinking softly. Her hands moved steady, wringing the cloth, smoothing it over Lila's brow. She'd seen fever before, in her father's house, in the eyes of a sister who didn't wake. The memory sat heavy, but Clara pushed it down, her fingers gentle, her breath slow. She hummed a tune, low and broken, something her mother once sang. The notes felt foreign, but they steadied her. Silas was gone, hauling timber to a camp miles off. The boys, Jonah and Sam, stood by the door, their boots scuffing the threshold. "Pa should be here," Jonah muttered, his chipped tooth catching the lantern's light. Clara nodded, not looking up. She couldn't fix their fear, but she could keep Lila cool, keep her breathing. She stirred a pot of broth over the fire, the steam rising like a ghost. The spoon scraped the pot's bottom, a rhythm against the wind's wail. Night fell, heavy as a stone. Clara stayed by Lila, her knees aching, her hands never still. She wiped the girl's face, changed the cloth, whispered her name. Lila stirred once, her small hand brushing Clara's, her fingers hot and fragile as a sparrow's wing. Clara froze, her heart loud in her chest. She held Lila's hand, just for a moment, then let go, Afraid to claim what wasn't hers. By dawn, the fever broke. Layla's breathing eased, her chest rising steady, her eyes clearer. Clara sat back, her shoulders stiff, the quilt slipped to the floor. Ellie knelt beside her, silent, her eyes red-rimmed. She didn't speak, but her hand rested near Clara's, close enough to feel its warmth. Jonah brought a cup of water, his. Steps hesitant, the tin cup trembling in his grip. Sam watched from the corner, his dirt-smudged face soft for the first time. Clara took the cup, her fingers brushing Jonah's, and drank. The water tasted of iron, sharp, and real. Days passed, and the cabin shifted. Not loud, not sudden, but like a river carving stone. Ellie lingered when Clara cooked, her hands hovering over the dough, mimicking Clara's need. Jonah stopped darting away, his laughter spilling when Clara patched his torn sleeve, her needle flashing in the firelight. Sam brought her a smooth stone from the creek, dropping it in her palm without a word, his eyes shy. Lila was slowest, her small frame still weak, but one evening she crawled onto Clara's lap, her doll pressed between them. Clara held her breath, afraid to move, the weight of the child both heavy and light. The first time Ellie called her Mama, it was a slip, quick and quiet over supper. The word hung in the air, fragile as a spider's thread. Clara's spoon paused, her eyes on the table's cracked grain. Ellie flushed, her braid swinging as she looked away. No one spoke. The fire crackled, and the wind chime sang outside, its notes thin but clear. Clara swallowed, her throat tight, and kept eating. The words settled in her chest, warm and sharp, like a coal that could burn or comfort. Lila's voice came next, small and sure, as Clara tucked her into bed. "Clara," she said, not Mama, but the sound was sunlight through frost, bright and unexpected. Clara's hand stilled on the quilt, her fingers tracing its worn patches. She smiled, just a curve of her lips, and brushed Lila's hair back. The girl's eyes closed, her breath soft, her doll tucked under her chin. Silas saw it all, his gray eyes quiet, his hands still on his axe or his hat. He didn't speak of it, didn't name the change. But one night, as Clara swept the floor, he set a chipped mug on the table, filled with wildflowers, their petals bruised but bright. Clara paused, the broom still, her eyes on the flowers' fragile stems. She didn't thank him, didn't need to. The cabin felt less like a cage now, its walls softened by small, steady hands reaching for her. The wagon creaked into town, its wheels grinding through dust thick as ash. Clara sat beside Silas, her hands folded, the hem of her dress patched but clean. The children rode in the back, their voices low, Lila's doll swinging from her small fist. The air smelled of hay and horse sweat, the sun high and unforgiving. Clara's chest tightened as the town square came into view, its wooden platform still standing, a ghost of her shame. She smoothed her skirt, her fingers catching on a loose thread, her breath shallow as a dry creek. The general store's bell jangled as they stepped inside. Clara carried a basket, her steps careful, her eyes on the floor's worn planks. The children scattered, Jonah eyeing a jar of peppermint sticks, Ellie clutching a bolt of calico. Silas bartered at the counter, his voice steady, trading furs for flour and salt. Clara reached for a tin of coffee, her hand brushing a shelf, when a voice cut through, sharp as a blade. "Well, if it ain't the barren bride." Thomas, her ex-husband, leaned against a barrel, his grin crooked, his eyes glinting like oil. His mother, Agnes, stood beside him, her bonnet stiff, her lips pursed like she'd tasted sour milk. The store fell quiet, the air heavy with stares. Clara froze, the tin cold in her hand, her pulse loud in her ears. The word barren landed like a slap, familiar, but no less raw. Agnes stepped closer, her voice low, venomous. Thought you'd be gone by now. No man keeps a woman who can't. Give him sons. Her words dripped, each one a needle in Clara's skin. The basket trembled in her grip, its handle biting her palm. She wanted to shrink, to vanish into the floor's cracks, but her feet stayed rooted, her spine straight as a pine. Silas turned from the counter, his hat low, his eyes gray and steady. He stepped beside Clara, not touching, but close enough for her to feel his warmth. Enough, he said, his voice calm, like a river over stones. She's worth more than your words. He looked at Thomas, then Agnes, his gaze unflinching. You cast her out. You don't get to claim her pain. The store held its breath. Thomas's grin faltered, his hand twitching at his side. Anne's face reddened, her lips parting, but no words came. Silas didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His truth was a hammer, quiet but heavy. Clara's throat burned, her eyes on the floor where a spilled grain of wheat lay like a tiny star. She felt the children behind her, Ellie's sharp inhale, Jonah's boots shifting, Lila's small hand brushing her skirt. Thomas muttered something, low and mean, and left, Agnes trailing him like a shadow. The bell jangled again, harsh in. The silence. Clara exhaled, her fingers loosening on the basket. Silas nodded to the storekeeper, his hand brushing hers as he took the tin of coffee. Not a claim, just a gesture. She met his eyes, just for a moment, and saw no pity, only a quiet respect. Back at the cabin, the days softened. Clara chopped onions, the knife's rhythm steady, tears blurring her eyes, but not her heart. She sewed a patch on Sam's trousers, her needle flashing in the lantern's glow. She braided Lila's hair, her fingers gentle, the girl's warmth a small anchor. The children's laughter filled the cabin now, not loud, but constant, like a stream finding its course. Clara moved. Among them, her steps lighter, her hands sure. She wasn't their mother, not by blood, but she was something else, something they chose. One evening, as the sun sank, painting the sky in shades of fire, Clara stood by the creek, a bucket heavy in her hands. The water rippled, catching the light, its surface alive with fleeting gold. She thought of the town, of Thomas's sneer, of Agnes's words. They stung, but less now, like a bruise fading under the skin. She set the bucket down, her fingers tracing its dented rim, and looked at the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and steady. Inside, Ellie stirred the stew. Jonah whittled a stick. Leela sang to her doll. Silas sat by the fire, his axe resting against the wall, its handle worn smooth by his grip. Clara's chest ached, not with shame, but with something new, purpose. Not the kind that shouted, but the kind that grew, quiet as roots in the earth. She didn't need to birth a child to build a life. She saw it in the mended shirts, the swept floor, the way Lila's hand fit in hers. She saw it in Silas's nod, in the children's eyes, no longer sharp with doubt. The bucket's weight felt lighter now, its water clear, reflecting the last of the sun. Clara turned back to the cabin, her shadow long and steady, her steps sure. She was no one's but her own, and yet she belonged. The sky turned mean, a flat gray that swallowed the sun. The Wyoming summer baked the earth, cracking it like old leather. Clara stood at the cabin's edge, her boots dusted red, a canteen heavy in her hand. The garden, once green, lay brittle corn, stalks drooping, beans shriveled to husks. The creek ran thin, its water barely a whisper over the stones. Clara's dress clung to her, damp with sweat, the hem frayed where it caught on thorns. She poured a trickle from the canteen, the soil drinking it greedily, giving nothing back. Inside, the cabin sweltered. The children moved slow, their faces Flushed, their voices hushed. Ellie fanned Lila with a torn newspaper, the pages curling at the edges. Jonah whittled the stick, his knife scraping dully, shavings falling like ash. Sam stared out the window, his hands idle, a bead of sweat tracing his cheek. Silas worked the field, his axe silent now, his shoulders bent under the weight of dying. Crops. Clara saw the worry in his eyes, gray as storm clouds, though he never spoke it. Then fever took him. Silas collapsed by the woodpile, his shirt soaked, his breath ragged. Clara and Jonah dragged him inside, his weight heavy, his skin hot as a kettle. They laid him on the pallet, the straw crackling under him. Clara knelt, her hands steady, dipping a cloth in the last of the creek water. She pressed it to his brow, the droplets sliding down his temple, pooling in the hollow of his throat. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, but he gripped her wrist, faint, but firm. "Keep them safe," he whispered, his voice gravel and dust. Clara didn't sleep. She moved between Silas and the garden, her steps heavy, her hands never still. She carried water from the creek, bucket by bucket, her arms aching, the handle cutting her palms. She poured it over the cracked earth, her breath sharp, her hair falling loose. The soil stayed stubborn, but Clara kept on, her shadow long in the moonlight, her hands raw. She nursed Silas through the nights, changing cloths, spooning broth past his cracked lips. The children watched, their eyes wide, their silence louder than the wind. Ellie helped now, her hands mimicking Clara's, stirring the fire, folding. Damp cloths. Jonah hauled wood, his chipped tooth flashing when Clara nodded thanks. Sam carried buckets, his small frame straining, water sloshing over the rims. Leela clung to her doll, whispering to it, her voice a soft prayer. Clara saw their fear, saw their trust. She didn't speak of it, just kept moving, stirring, wiping, watering, her hands a rhythm against despair. One morning, as dawn broke pale and thin, Clara saw it. A single tomato, small and green, pushing through the cracked earth. It was no. Bigger than a child's fist, its stem fragile, its leaves curled but alive. Clara knelt, her knees sinking into the dirt, her fingers hovering over the fruit. She didn't touch it, afraid it might vanish. Her breath caught, a sound between a laugh and a sob. The garden was still dying, but this one thing lived, stubborn. As she was, she called the children. They gathered, their bare feet stirring dust, their eyes bright with wonder. Ellie touched the tomato's skin, her fingers gentle, her braids swinging. Jonah grinned, his knife still in his hand. Sam crouched, his stone-smooth hands resting on his knees. Lila reached out, her doll forgotten, her small voice naming it Red Star. Silas, propped on the pallet, watched from the window, his fever broken, his face pale but steady. Clara met his eyes, and he nodded, a ghost of a smile on his lips. That evening, the tomato ripened, a faint blush against the green. Clara plucked it, her hands careful, the fruit warm in her palm. She carried it inside, the children trailing, her like ducklings. On the table, she sliced it with a knife, its juice seeping into the wood. 5 slivers, thin as hope, one for each of them. They ate in silence, the taste sharp and sweet, a burst of life in their mouths. Clara chewed slowly, her eyes on the table's grain, the juice staining her fingers. It wasn't much, but it was everything a treasure born of grit, a promise. Carved from drought, the cabin felt alive again, the air softer, the fires crackled brighter. Clara washed the knife, her hands steady, the water in the basin catching the lantern's glow. She felt the children's eyes on her, not sharp now, but warm, like the tomato's fleeting red. Silas rose, slow and weak, and set his hand on the table near hers, not touching but close. The wind chime sang outside, its notes thin but unbroken. Clara looked at the empty plate, at the faint stain of juice, and knew she'd fought for more than crops. She'd fought for this a family, a place, a life reborn from dust. The wind carried the scent of iron and progress. Men in stiff coats came to the cabin, their boots polished, their papers crisp. They stood at the edge of the land, pointing to the horizon where tracks would soon claw through the Wyoming wilds. Clara watched from the garden, her hands dusted with soil, a trowel resting against her knee. The tomato vines had spread, their leaves green, their fruit small but steady. She wiped her brow, her sleeve catching a smudge of earth, and listened. As the men's voices rose, sharp with promises of money, Silas met them at the gate, his flannel shirt patched, his hat low over his gray eyes. The children stood behind him, Ellie's arms crossed, Jonah's knife idle in his pocket, Sam and Lila peering from the porch. The lead man, his mustache waxed, offered a stack of bills thick as a Bible. "Enough to start over," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "The railroad's coming, whether you stay or not." Clara's hand stilled, the trowel cold in her grip. She saw the weight in Silas's shoulders, the way his fingers tightened on the gate's rough wood. The land was hard rocky soil, stingy rains, winters that bit deep, but it was theirs. She thought of the tomato, of the buckets she'd carried, of the nights spent nursing fevers. She thought of the cabin's creaking boards, the quilts, worn patches, the wind chime's fragile song. Silas shook his head, his voice low but firm. "Not for sale." The men argued, their words sharp, but Silas didn't waver. He pointed to the cabin, to the garden, to Clara kneeling in the dirt. "Someone was allowed to stay here," he said, his eyes steady. "That's enough." The men left, their boots kicking dust, their papers crumpled. Silas hammered a sign into the ground by the road, "Not for sale." The letters were uneven, carved with a knife, but they stood bold against the sagebrush. Clara rose, her knees stiff, and met his gaze. She didn't speak, just nodded, her hand brushing the tomato vines. The wind chime sang, its notes clear in the dusk. The children ran to her, Lila's small hand slipping into hers, Jonah's grin flashing. The sign wasn't just for the land. It was for her, for them, for the life they built from cracks in the earth. Years turned, steady as seasons. The children grew, their shadows stretching long across the land. Ellie married a blacksmith, her braid replaced by a bun, her hands strong as she shaped bread for her own table. Jonah took to the woods, his axe echoing Silas's, his chipped tooth still catching the light. Sam built a house nearby, his smooth stones lining its hearth. Leela, now tall, taught school, her voice soft but sure, her doll long packed away. Grandchildren came, their laughter spilling through the cabin like water over stones. Clara moved slower now, her hair streaked gray, her hands knotted from years. Of work, the garden thrived, its rows thick with beans, corn, and tomatoes, their red skins bright as hope. She tended it daily, her trowel worn thin, her canteen dented but full. The children called it the garden, never Clara's, but she didn't mind. Its roots were hers, woven deep, like the family she'd claimed. One evening, as the sun sank, painting the sky in shades of amber, Silas sat on the porch, a knife in his hand. He carved into a plank, his movements slow, his fingers steady despite their tremble. Clara watched from the doorway, a shawl around her shoulders, its edges frayed. The grandchildren played in the dirt, their voices high, their hands smudged. With earth. Silas set the plank against the garden's edge, its words clear in the fading light. "She did not bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life." Clara's breath caught, her hand rising to her throat, where a pulse beat. Soft and fast. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just stepped closer, her shoes scuffing the porch. Silas looked up, his gray eyes warm, like a river under sunlight. He reached for her hand, his fingers rough but gentle, and she took it, her own hand steady. The grandchildren paused, their eyes curious, but Clara only saw the carving, its letters a quiet hymn to her place. The garden became the soul of the household, its harvest shared at tables near and far. Neighbors spoke of it, travelers stopped to see it, its green a miracle in the rocky wilds. Clara worked it until her back bent, her hands planting seeds, pulling weeds, pouring water from the same dented canteen. The wind chimes still hung by. The door, its song softer now, but never silent. Clara stood among the vines, her shadow small but sure, and knew this was her legacy, not blood, but love, grown daily, chosen daily, like water poured on thirsty earth. The years carved lines into Clara's face, deep as the Wyoming earth. Her hands, once quick, moved slower now, their knuckles swollen, their skin thin as parchment. The garden still bloomed, its tomatoes red against the green, its beans curling. Pulp poles like old friends. Clara knelt there daily, her trowel a faithful companion, its handle smooth from her grip. The wind chime hung by the cabin door, its notes faint, weathered by time, but still singing when the breeze stirred. She'd pause sometimes, her eyes on the mountains, their peaks sharp against a sky that never changed. Clara's breath grew short one spring, her chest heavy, like a stone pressed against her ribs. She sat beneath the cottonwood tree, its branches heavy with buds, its shade cool on her face. The grandchildren gathered, their voices soft, their hands holding hers, small and warm. Ellie, now a mother, smoothed Clara's shawl, its threads worn thin. Jonah carved a new peg for the gate, his chipped tooth still flashing. Sam brought water, his smooth stones lining the path to the tree. Lila read aloud, her voice steady, a book resting in her lap. Clara smiled, her lips pale, her eyes bright as the creek at dawn. Silas sat beside her, his gray hair thin, his hands folded over a cane. He didn't speak much now, but his presence was a quilt, warm and steady. Clara leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, the scent of pine and flannel clinging to him. The wind chime sang, a single note, clear and fragile. Clara closed her eyes, her breath slow, and slipped away. The tree's roots cradling her, the garden's green her last sight. The grandchildren wept quietly, their tears falling like rain on dry soil. They buried her beneath the cottonwood, where the wind-chimed song could reach her. The marker was simple, a flat stone from the creek, its surface smooth, etched with her name, Clara. No words could hold what she'd been. The garden bloomed on, its vines curling, its fruit heavy, as if she still walked its rows. Silas lived on, his steps slower, his eyes often on the tree. He'd sit on the porch, his cane, tapping the boards, the grandchildren's laughter filling the air. The garden was their work now, their hands planting where Clara's had. Silas carved one last thing, a small bird, its wings spread, left on her stone. He joined her years later, his breath fading as the sun sank, the mountains watching like old sentinels. They laid him beside her, the earth soft, the cottonwood's leaves whispering overhead, the cabin aged, its logs silvered, its roof patched by new hands. The grandchildren grew, their own children running through the garden, their laughter echoing Clara's quiet hymns. The sign still stood by the road, not for sale. Its wood was weathered, its letters faint, but it held firm, rooted like the cottonwood. Travelers passing saw it, their wagons creaking, their eyes curious. Some stopped, drawn to the garden's green, its rose a miracle in the rocky wilds. They'd ask about the sign, and the grandchildren would tell the story of a woman cast out, of a man who gave her a home, of a family grown from dust. The garden never faltered. It fed the household, its harvest shared at tables near and far. Tomatoes ripened, their juice sweet, their skins bright as Clara's memory. Beans climbed, corn stood tall, and wildflower seeds Clara once scattered dotted the edges, their petals soft as her touch. The wind chime, rusted but singing, hung on, its notes a thread through time. The grandchildren taught their children to tend the earth, to pour water from a dented canteen, to kneel in the dirt as Clara had. Years turned to decades. The railroad came, its tracks skirting the land, never touching it. The sign stood, a quiet monument, its words a vow kept. Travelers still saw it, their horses snorting, their boots stirring dust. They spoke of the garden, of the woman who turned exile into home, drought into bloom. Some said they felt her there, in the rustle of leaves, in the chime's faint song. In the earth's stubborn green dot, a cottonwood grew, its roots deep, its branches wide. Beneath it, two stones lay side by side, their edges softened by rain. The garden stretched around them, alive, unending. The grandchildren, now gray, stood, their sometimes, their hands full of soil, their eyes on the horizon. They didn't speak of Clara and Silas, didn't need to. The land spoke for them, its roots woven with theirs, its harvest a hymn to their love. And so it went, season after season, the garden blooming, the sign standing, the wind chimed singing. Clara's life, once cast away, had taken root deeper than blood, stronger than stone. The Wyoming wilds held her story, quiet but sure, a testament to a woman who chose, day by day, to turn dust into life, and a man who let her.